somebody was kind enough to leave me some reading material. Thanks, whoever it was. Well, I'd like to begin these, which will be pretty informal remarks, by reading a few things from a recent article in the Hebrew press in Israel. This is by a journalist named Nahum Barnea, who's one of the leading doves and one of the leading Israeli journalists. It's about a meeting between Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin from the Labor Party and leaders of the Peace Now group, the sort of mainstream peace group. And the article's entitled, it's February 24th, and it's entitled Happy in Their Lot. And it describes how Rabin came to the meeting relaxed and happy, and he explained that he was particularly pleased about the U.S. Dialogue with the PLO, which he said was a very successful operation from Israel's point of view, despite what they may be saying publicly. It was a low-level discussion which had no significance, and its purpose was as a delaying action from the point of view of the United States to allow Israel a year at least, he said, to put down the uprising by force while these delaying operations go on. And he said the Palestinians in the occupied territories are now under harsh military and economic pressure, and he predicted that they will be broken and that they will accept Israel's terms. So the U.S. diplomatic maneuver, he concluded, is a delaying effort, and mainly to give Israel time to crush the Intifada, the uprising, and that's very much in Israel's interest, so he's very pleased about it all. Well, there's every reason to suppose that this is an accurate description. I think there's been every reason to suppose that ever since the United States agreed to the dialogue on December 14th in what was described as a stunning breakthrough and a tremendous triumph of American diplomacy and one of the great momentous events of modern history, and so on and so forth. As the Bush administration finally made public its terms, the point becomes quite obvious. There was a front-page article in the New York Times a couple days ago, March 12th, in which the Bush administration leaked the terms that it's proposing to both sides. To Israel, the proposals are that they reduce some of the repressive measures that they've instituted since the uprising began. So in other words, return to a situation just somewhat more oppressive than before the uprising. And for the Palestinians, there should be, I'll just read the actual wording, a halt to violent demonstrations in the territories, that means an end to the uprising, blocking anti-Israeli raids from southern Lebanon, stopping distribution of inflammatory leaflets. So in other words, they should stop everything and go back to the situation prior to the uprising, and Israel will go back to a somewhat more repressive situation than before, and then we can go on. Now, some of these terms are particularly interesting. I mean, violent demonstrations, that can mean, for example, declaring a liberated village, which says it's going to run its own affairs, and then when Israeli soldiers come in to break up this violence, maybe throwing stones at them and so on, that's what's called violent demonstrations. The blocking of anti-Israeli raids in southern Lebanon is an interesting case. There has been you recall about a week or two ago, there was, in fact, for the last several weeks, there's been a good deal of concern over whether the PLO is living up to its renunciation of terrorism, because there have been attacks against Israeli soldiers in southern Lebanon. Notice it's taken for granted that Israeli soldiers have a right to be in southern Lebanon, where they, in fact, carry out constant terrorist activities, which are typically not reported. There are two kinds. They're the kinds in the areas of southern Lebanon that Israel has virtually annexed as its security zone, where just in the last month or so, about 100 people have been expelled, women, children, and old men in this case, because the villages, their villages have refused to cooperate with the South Lebanon Army. That's a terrorist mercenary army that Israel's established to control southern Lebanon. And Israeli forces are there to ensure that it does control them. The Israeli forces themselves have been storming the villages to drive people out. That's not considered terrorism. And also not considered terrorism are the regular Israeli bombings north of their security zone that is throughout the rest of Lebanon. Just 2 weeks ago, for example, a bombing raid that happened to hit a school and wounded 26 children, 5 of them critically. Nobody knows what the further results are because nobody reported it. Last year, in 1988, according to Lebanese police, there were about 128 people killed and several hundred wounded, and many of them civilians in these raids. But that's not a problem of terrorism. Terrorism is if Lebanese or Palestinians attack Israeli soldiers in Lebanon. That's the kind of terrorism that they're called upon to stop. Well, if we look further, we find still more reason to believe that the defense minister Rabin's interpretation is accurate. The protocols of the first meeting between the U.S. ambassador in Tunis, Robert Pelletreau, and the PLO, those protocols were leaked. They were published in the Egyptian press in a newspaper close to President Mubarak, and they were then translated into English and published in the Jerusalem Post, January 6th, so you can read them if you like, or if you want another source, you can read the relevant excerpts from them in an article of mine in Z Magazine this month, which is the first publication of them in the United States, as far as I know. The protocols state, the Jerusalem Post article begins by expressing its pleasure that the United States has accepted Israel's terms completely in the dialogue with the Palestinians, and it then goes on to give the verbatim transcripts. The U.S. delegate opens the discussion by saying that the United States has 2 demands that it insists upon. The first demand is that the Palestinians call off the uprising, which the United States regards as terrorism directed against the State of Israel. Okay, so if the Palestinians declare liberated villages in the West Bank under military occupation, the United States regards that as terrorism directed against the State of Israel and calls upon the PLO to stop it. If they don't stop it, they've backed off from their alleged commitment to stop terrorism. Now, of course, if the Palestinians, notice incidentally that they call on the PLO to call off the uprising, the assumption being that the PLO could call off the uprising, or that the PLO initiated the uprising. Now, it's conceivable that U.S. and Israeli intelligence actually believe this. It's total nonsense, as anyone who's actually bothered to look at the facts is aware. The PLO is no more capable of calling off the uprising than you are. And in fact, was very surprised by it. It's a spontaneous, popular revolution, in fact. But typically, over the years, wherever we have records, intelligence, CIA, the Mossad, the FBI, I mean, any intelligence agency that I know of, has been completely incapable of understanding the dynamics of popular movements. They make the most colossal errors in their effort to deal with this. I could give you some examples if you like. And they must assume that they're directed from outside by some, hostile force, because that's the only doctrinally tenable approach to the fact. You can't, there's a good deal of ideological fanaticism in the interpretations given by intelligence agencies, which is one reason why they're always falling flat on their face, as they do time and time again, including the ones that are constantly praised for their great achievements, mostly fabricated. So it is conceivable that U.S. and Israeli intelligence actually believe that the PLO could call off the uprising, and therefore the American ambassador believed it. Or it could be that this is just a put-on. In any event, if the Palestinians were to call off the uprising, the situation would return to the prior status quo, when the United States was quite prepared to continue supporting the quite harsh and oppressive and brutal military regime, and to pay for it, and to pay for Israeli settlements, and to block a political settlement, and so on. That is, we would simply return to the status quo ante. That's the first American demand. Go back to the situation in which nothing was happening and there was no pressure for any political settlement. The second U.S. demand was equally interesting. The PLO was told that the second minimal condition for continuing these discussions seriously is that they abandon any commitment to an international conference and enter into direct negotiations with Israel, which Israel incidentally refuses. Now, what's the importance of that? Well, the importance of that is that the international community, with virtual unanimity, is committed, in fact rather deeply committed, to a political settlement of what they perceive correctly to be a highly inflammatory and dangerous conflict. The United States, in contrast, is committed to opposing and blocking a political settlement. Therefore, and that's been going on for years, I'll give the background. Now, if there is an international conference, no matter who's in it, if it's the Russians or the Europeans or the non-aligned countries or just about anybody you can pick, they're going to be pressing for a political settlement, for a diplomatic settlement. And since the United States is opposed to that, we don't want such pressures. We want direct negotiations in which Israel, with U.S. backing, can simply take the position that the United States supports, namely continue the status quo without a political settlement, and without any external pressures. There'll be no, or external framework for continuing the discussion. There'll be no further danger that things might move in the direction that the United States can't control. So that's the meaning, the plain meaning of the call for rejecting an international conference. There's another factor behind that, and that is that the United States simply does not tolerate other nations becoming involved in what the U.S. government regards as its turf. And the Middle East is its turf and has been for a long time, so others should keep their fingers out of it, hence no international conference. It's for similar reasons that the United States strongly opposed and succeeded in undermining the Contadora negotiations in Latin America, where the Latin American democracies tried to involve themselves in a political settlement in Central America and so on. Well, those are the two U.S. demands. One, call off the uprising so we go back to the prior status quo when nothing was happening, and the United States, meaning you and me, the taxpayers, continued to support the repression, the expansion, the continued integration of the territories into Israel and so on. That's demand number one. And demand number two is no international conference, that is, no international pressures for a diplomatic settlement, that is, continue to block progress. Well, those are the U.S. positions, and that explains why Yitzhak Rabin, the Labor Defense Minister, is so pleased and so satisfied with his lot and so tranquil about the fact that the United States is carrying on this dialogue, this delaying action to give Israel another year to crush the uprising by force, which he thinks will succeed. Well, if you look at the background for all of this, at the background developments, I think these current activities and processes fall into place and become quite intelligible. You recall that the great diplomatic breakthrough, the great diplomatic success that the press hailed all over the front pages took place on December 14th, 1988. And that was the time when Yasser Arafat was supposed to have said the magic words that the United States was demanding that he say all along, but he had always refused. And he had repeated the George Shultz appeared on television, and his lugubrious voice explained that Arafat had finally dropped his ambiguity and had repeated the words that the United States had written out for him, and therefore we were willing to enter into negotiations. Tremendous diplomatic breakthrough. The fact of the matter, as anyone who took 5 minutes could have discovered, are that Arafat's statements at the press conference in question were as remote from the U.S. demands as they had always been. In fact, Arafat's statements were precisely distinct from the U.S. demands in crucial respects and were identical to the positions that he'd been taking for the past 13 years. Now, that would have taken about 5 minutes to figure out, but you won't find that mentioned anywhere. The press, universally, to my knowledge, repeated that Arafat had capitulated, accepted the U.S. demands, and now we could have a dialogue with him. I'll come back to what the significance of that fact is, but let me put it in a little bit of historical context, and then I'll clarify what I mean by what I just said. As I say, it'll take you 5 minutes of research to figure it out. You just have to look at the texts that were published in the New York Times, and you will see immediately that it's true. And the differences between the U.S. position, which Arafat did not take, and the PLO position, which he did take, are very substantive and very critical. If the PLO had accepted the U.S. demands, they would have totally capitulated to U.S.-Israeli terms. And abandoned any right to self-determination, in fact. We'll come back to that. But now let's take a little bit of a look at the history, because this has been going on for a long time. It's been going on for quite a long time. There has been a general international consensus, very broad international consensus on the general terms of a political settlement in the Middle East of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, there's a little bit of vacillation about the details, but the general terms are quite clear, and they are expressed in document after document. These proposal of this sort came to the United Nations Security Council in January 1976, 13 years ago. It was a resolution which called for a political settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict on the internationally recognized borders, that's the pre-June 1967 borders, with a Palestinian state established in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and with international guarantees for the integrity, sovereignty, and security of every state in the region, and guarantees for the right of every state to live in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. Those of you who are familiar with the diplomacy will note that the terms in which this proposal were expressed were precisely the wording of UN 242, United Nations Resolution 242, which is widely understood and accepted, particularly by the United States, to be the foundation for a political settlement. The terms were different from UN 242 in one crucial respect. UN 242 refers only to states. It offers nothing to the Palestinians, and this extended the terms of UN 242 to the Palestinians. That was January 1976. That resolution was supported by most of the world, by most of Europe, by the non-aligned countries, the Soviet Union. It was not only supported by the Arab states, but introduced by the major Arab states. It was introduced by Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, the three so-called confrontation states, the ones involved in the direct conflict. It was supported publicly by the PLO, and in fact, according to Israel's delegate, Chaim Herzog, who's now president, it was actually prepared by the PLO. So here you have a very broad support for a political settlement, and that has it was vetoed by the United States. The resolution was vetoed by the United States, and that terminated it. Notice that in January 1976, the PLO and Arafat explicitly endorsed the wording of UN 242, the actual wording, while extending it to a Palestinian state. That's precisely the position that Arafat took on December 14th, 1988, when he stated the magic words. Nothing had changed in between. Same is true of the other points. The United States vetoed it at that time, and it's trying to block it now. That's the meaning of the current delaying action. Now, between 1976 and today, there have been repeated efforts to introduce a settlement of approximately that sort. The Arab states and the PLO have repeatedly called for negotiations with Israel leading to mutual recognition of Israel and the Palestinians, recognition of the right to national self-determination of both groups, the right of both to live in peace and security, and so on. It's always been blocked by Israel and the United States. Israel's reaction to the UN session in 1976, incidentally, was to refuse to attend and to state Yitzhak Rabin was then the prime minister of what was considered a dovish labor cabinet. They stated that they would not deal with the PLO, even if the PLO were to renounce terrorism and to recognize the state of Israel, and they would not deal with any Palestinians on any political issue. That was the dovish Labor Party position at the time. Israel's reaction to the calling of the UN session was the typical one. They bombed Lebanon, killing about 50 people, according to Lebanese sources. That was reported in the United States, but since it's considered quite normal, there was no reaction to it. Recall that Israel is a client state of the United States. Therefore, it inherits certain rights from us, including the right to kill anybody it feels like. That's our right, so therefore it's inherited by any client. And when they do it, you don't have to, you can report it maybe, but you don't have to bother commenting on it. Well, that was January 1976. I won't run through all the details since, but if you want, I'll give you more. They're easily documented and are documented in print. That's roughly the story from then to now. Now let's look back a little further. That is not the first proposal to solve the to reach a political settlement. The first proposal since the 1967 war was in February 1971. In February 1971, President Sadat of Egypt, who had just become president, called for a political settlement on the pre-June 1967 borders, the internationally recognized borders, with, again, the wording of UN 242, guarantees for the rights of all states to live in peace and security, et cetera, in fact, all the standard terms, and nothing for the Palestinians. In other words, that was a completely rejectionist proposal. He offered nothing to the Palestinians, zero. Israel recognized it as a genuine peace offer and rejected it on the grounds that if they held out, they could get better territorial concessions. Now, the United States backed Israel in that rejection, even though Sadat's proposal was framed in virtually the same terms. It was virtually identical with official United States government policy. What was happening in the United States at the time was that there was an internal conflict between two conceptions as to how to deal with the problem. One was the concept, I mean, symbolically, they were represented by Secretary of State William Rogers and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, respectively, but there were big power groups behind them. The Rogers position, which was expressed in the Rogers Plan, official U.S. policy from December 1969, was identical, essentially, with minor, trivial changes from Sadat's proposal. Kissinger, in contrast, supported what he wanted, what he called stalemate. The United States should just keep things the way they are, keep Israeli power in control. And in the internal conflict in Washington, Kissinger's position won out. In fact, shortly after, he managed to push Rogers out as head of the State Department, and he took over himself. And since that time, with very little change, a little wavering now and then, but basically, Kissinger's position, stalemate, in other words, support Israeli power and block a political settlement, that position has dominated U.S. policy and remains unchanged today, as these contemporary developments demonstrate. Now, what was the context of all of this? Well, the context of all of this was, there's a background context, and let me just, I should say before going on, that everything I've just described is easily documented, but it's missing from history. So when, say, the New York Times or scholarly monographs write about the peace process in the Middle East or the diplomatic history, they don't include these events. And they, nor do they include many other examples in which the PLO and the Arab states have pressed for such political settlements. The reason they don't include them is that the United States did not support them, and therefore they do not form part of the peace process. The term peace process has a technical meaning in U.S. discourse. It doesn't refer to some process leading to peace. That's naive. That's only what the dictionary says. The peace process refers to whatever the United States happens to be doing at the moment. That's the peace process. And since the United States was not supporting these things, they're not part of the peace process. So when the Times, say New York Times, does a rundown of the peace process, naturally they're not there. And the same is true of virtually all the scholarly literature, I should say. I'll come back to more about this tonight if you're around. But anyhow, that's what the peace process is. Therefore, this stuff is not in it. You can find it if you sort of dig through past issues of the New York Times, but it's not part of the history that people remember. It's just unacceptable fact, which therefore goes down the memory hole. But the real fact, the real unacceptable fact, is that since Kissinger's victory, essentially, over the Department of State in 1971, the United States has been insisting upon stalemate, that is, support for Israeli domination of the region, and that means blocking a political settlement, and there's every reason to believe that that's still continuing. Now, let's look a little more closely at first at the background, further background, and then at the details. Why this position? It's not just an irrational position. It has a logic behind it. You could argue that the logic is wrong, but you can't argue that there's no logic there. There is a logic there. The logic lies in the general U.S. geopolitical concern for the region. The United States has no particular concern for Israel. If Israel stopped being useful for U.S. purposes, it would go down the drain immediately. no moral concerns and no concerns for the greatest democracy in the Middle East and so on. All of that's there to justify policies taken on other grounds. People who think otherwise are going to be due for a rude surprise when U.S. policy finally does change, as it's likely to do. The concern of the United States in the region is basically oil. It was recognized since the 1940s that the Arabian Peninsula is the major source of energy, cheap, easily accessible energy for the next several generations, and that whoever controls that oil will basically dominate the world, meaning dominate, and if the United States controls it, it will have extensive power over its major enemies in the world, which are Western Europe and Japan. The Soviet Union is a rhetorical enemy, but Western Europe and Japan are real enemies because it was recognized already then, are potential rivals. By now they're quite real rivals, not potential ones anymore. And control over oil, control over their energy resources gives the United States veto power, as George Kennan put it years ago, in case they get out of line. He happened to be referring specifically to Japan, but the same is true of Europe. So the United States, which did not need the oil for itself at that time, and in fact still doesn't really, the United States and the Western Hemisphere, totally controlled by the United States, was the major oil producer, more than half the oil in the world until 1968. But the United States needed control over the oil as part of the mechanism for controlling the contours of the general global order that it intended to dominate. And that was taken very seriously. The oil of the Middle East was described by the State Department back in 1944 as a stupendous material resource and the greatest strategic prize in world history. And that characterization continues for a year after many years, and in fact still does. When the declassified documents emerge about today, 30 years from now, I don't doubt that you'll find similar comments. Now, how do you control the oil? Well, what threat is there to it? The same threat that there is to U.S. access to resources everywhere in the world. If you study U.S. foreign policy seriously, that is, you look at the actual documentary record of top-level planning, you discover a constant strain. The United States must be opposed to what are called nationalistic regimes. That means regimes that are responsive to pressures from the masses of their own population for improvement in low living standards and diversification of production and control of their own resources. Those are essentially quotes from document after document after document. Now, these regimes are what are sometimes called ultra-nationalist, or another term for them is radical nationalist. Now, radical here has nothing to do with politics. They can be ultra-right regimes run by some, military dictatorship. They're still radical nationalists if they're responsive to the need to domestic concerns, instead of being responsive to the overriding rights of U.S. investors. That's what counts. And if they don't meet that condition, they're radical regimes, or they're ultra-nationalist, or they're a threat, and they have to be overcome, either by military force or some other means. So you have to stop radical nationalism, nationalist regimes which try to carry out development for domestic needs instead of for the transcendent needs of U.S. investors. And in the Middle East, they were also concerned about radical nationalism, radical Arab nationalism. Now, what do you do about it? Well, running through the record, you find that at first the United States was not entirely clear about what to do about it. There was a debate. When General Nasser took over in Egypt in 1952, 53, around then, it was thought, there was a split among U.S. policymakers. Some thought that he could be our boy in the Middle East, that is, that he could be the U.S. agent in the Middle East. And there was support for Nasser in the early period. But within a couple of years, it became clear that he was one of those radical nationalists, that he was an independent nationalist force. He sort of headed up the non-aligned movement, and in general, he was making waves. He was stimulating independent nationalist forces in the Arab world, and therefore he had to be stopped. That was obvious by the mid-50s. In 1958, the National Security Council, so that's the highest level of planning, produced a memorandum which stated that in the context of U.S. opposition to radical Arab nationalism, a rational policy would be support for Israel as the only reliable, pro-U.S. force in the region. Now, that's the first recognition that I have been able to discover of what is now called the strategic asset thesis, the idea that Israel is a strategic asset which can serve U.S. needs. And the primary needs are to control and bar radical Arab nationalism, independent nationalist forces, which might ultimately threaten U.S. domination of the oil-producing regions. And this goes on. In the 1960s, these concerns intensified as there was a conflict, in fact, an actual war between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Saudi Arabia is what we really worry about. That's where most of the oil is. And as long as that oil is under the control of Saudi Arabian elites, nobody cares, because Saudi Arabian elites are regarded as sort of honorary Americans, like the South Africans. South Africans regard the Japanese as honorary whites. We regard the Saudi Arabian elites as honorary Americans. They went to Harvard Business School, you know, they do what we tell them, and they'll run things in our interest. It's the radical nationalists we're worried about, the ones who aren't honorary Americans. There was a conflict between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, reaching the level of actual war in the early 60s, and that was considered very dangerous because support for radical Arab nationalism in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Principates and so on, that could be dangerous to the major sources of oil, meaning they might fall under domestic control. In 1967, Israel, in fact, was regarded at the time by U.S. intelligence as a barrier to radical nationalist pressures against the Arabian Peninsula, against Saudi Arabia. Well, all of that came to a head in 1967. In 1967, Israel, with extensive U.S. backing, public U.S. backing, maybe actual more than just backing, but at least public U.S. backing, won a major military victory. It smashed the major Arab force, Egypt, also Syria, conquered the Sinai, the Syrian Golan Heights, the West Bank, expelled a couple 100,000 people, and implanted itself in this region as a kind of a regional superpower. Now, that was considered a big victory in the United States. There was a lot of applause. The reason was that, I mean, whatever the population may have felt, the reason among planners was that this broke the back of radical Arab nationalism. It terminated the radical nationalist threat to Saudi Arabia, so it was assumed. And Israel won a lot of points on that. It's at that point that the close U.S.-Israeli alliance begins. We're now getting up to 1970 and 71. By 1971, when Sadat made his proposal, other things were happening in the world as well. The United States at that time was beginning to suffer the serious costs of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War changed power relations. It was extremely costly to the United States, and it was very beneficial to the rivals of the United States. Canada, Europe, and Japan were enriching themselves on the destruction of Indochina as offshore producers of war materials and so on. And that really shifted the balance considerably between the United States and its main rivals, and something had to be done about it. In fact, lots of things were done. But one thing that was done was to change the conception of how you run the world. What was introduced at that time was what was called the Nixon Doctrine, about 1970-71. Now, the Nixon Doctrine was based on a recognition of the reality that the United States could not police the entire world itself, just didn't have the capacity to do that anymore. And therefore, we had to have what the Secretary of Defense called local cops on the beat, local gendarmes who would run particular areas for us, with police headquarters, of course, in Washington. The way Henry Kissinger put it, in a little more academic terms, he said other powers will have regional responsibilities which they will carry out within the overall framework of order managed by the United States. So that's a kind of a derogation of authority. You've got these regional authorities there, the local cops, and they sort of run their own affairs. They run the local region, and we give them the general framework. That's the Nixon Doctrine. Well, with regard to the Middle East, and that was applied for the entire world. The United States is a global power. With regard to the Middle East, the local cops on the beat were supposed to be Israel and Iran. Iran was then under the Shah. Israel and Iran had a very close alliance. How close it is, we only learned after the fall of the Shah, when a lot of documentation came out in Israel, very little of it published here, which showed what a deep alliance that was. In fact, it was quite remarkable. Of course, the United States knew all about it. So it was a secret but real alliance. the idea was that Iran and Israel, both heavily armed by the United States, would serve as local cops on the beat to prevent radical Arab nationalism from getting out of hand. Now, that point of view is expressed quite openly by the leading U.S. government specialists on the area, Senator Henry Jackson in particular, who was the leading Senate expert on oil in the Middle East, pointed out that Iran, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, that's basically where the oil is, Iran, Israel, and Saudi Arabia have served to inhibit and contain those irresponsible and radical elements in certain Arab states who, were they free to do so, would pose a grave threat indeed to our principal sources of petroleum. The Saudis understand that Israel and Iran play a vital stabilizing role. The reason he added that last sentence is that theoretically, Saudi Arabia was at war with Israel and was at war with Iran. There was a war with Iran over the Iranian occupation of Arab islands in the Gulf, and theoretically they were at war with Israel. But Henry Jackson was pointing out to the sophisticated that that war was just for show. Basically, Saudi Arabia understood that there was an alliance. There was a tripartite alliance between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran, where Israel and Iran play a vital stabilizing role. That is, they repress radical Arab nationalism in the interests of the Saudi Arabian elite. And when Jackson said that the Saudi Arabians understand this, meaning the Saudi Arabian elite understands this, I think there's every reason to believe that he was correct. An Iranian diplomat at the same time pointed out that without Israeli power in the Middle East, the Shah of Iran feels that the Arabs would be difficult to contain and the Russians would very much gain an upper hand in the whole area. So from the Iranian point of view also, Israel, with whom they had a direct tacit alliance, not so tacit, in fact, an active alliance, which later became public, Israel played a stabilizing role, as Jackson put it, to contain radical Arabs. Well, that was the general picture. And it's in that context that Kissinger pressed for stalemate, that is, for maintaining Israeli power, for maintaining Israel as a dominant military force, as a militarized state, a highly militarized, technologically advanced state that could serve as a U.S. cop on the beat. Now, that's only part of the story, because by that time, Israel had accepted these arrangements, much to its detriment, in my view, but they had accepted them. And costs go along with that, or at least tasks go along with it. Israel was increasingly being called upon to play the role of a U.S. mercenary state for much of the world. In the 1960s, as these relationships began to crystallize, Israel helped the United States penetrate Black Africa with a huge CIA subvention, which became public later. That meant that there were states in Africa where the United States really couldn't directly intervene very easily, couldn't get the American public to accept it and so on, but Israel could do it for us. And that led to a lot of effects. Mobutu, the general of Zaire, was basically, he was installed really by U.S. subversion, but then he was maintained by Israeli power. They trained his guard, they armed him, and so on. Idi Amin, who the United States and Britain originally backed in Uganda, was placed in power partially with Israeli support and maintained that way. And the same was true across the region. You recall that the United States was then supporting secretly the racist white states, Rhodesia and South Africa. Couldn't do it publicly. Now, there was a United Nations embargo against sending oil to Rhodesia, but the United States was able to get around it by having Israel send the oil to Rhodesia, as the Department of Commerce later conceded. And in general, the establishment of pro-U.S., often very brutal military states in Africa proceeded with Israeli help. They were the mercenaries who carried it out. By the 1970s, these roles extended to Asia and particularly Latin America. As throughout Latin America in the late 60s and the early 70s, there was a kind of a plague of national security regimes, Nazi-style state military dictatorships installed with U.S. aid and support, first in Brazil and Uruguay and then Chile when the government was overthrown, and Argentina and so on. It was difficult for the United States to support them directly because of congressional human rights legislation and other things, but Israel could do it for us. So Israel established the relations with the neo-Nazi generals in Argentina and with the Pinochet government in Chile and sent them the arms and gave them the training and sent people to lecture at the War College and so on and so forth. They established the relations, and the United States, that's serving the United States. In the late 70s, these relationships extended. In the late 70s, and they extended to Central America, where massive repression was beginning. In Guatemala, there was real mass murder beginning in the late 70s. Again, the Carter administration couldn't openly support it because of congressional human rights legislation, but Israel was able to do it. They were able to provide the arms and the computer centers and the trainers and so on, along with other U.S. mercenary states like Taiwan, funding from Saudi Arabia and so on. Remember, the United States is a powerful state. It's a global power. Other countries hire terrorists. The United States hires mercenary states as terrorists. That's a new dimension in international terrorism. Nobody else even comes close. This network, bits and pieces of which were exposed in the Iran-Contra hearings if you bothered to read closely, but that's what it's really about. That was already developing in the 60s and especially in the 1970s, and Israel was only one of them. Taiwan's another. Saudi Arabia was the banker. And Japan supplied mercenaries. In fact, all of them are involved. It's a big, complicated international terrorist network. Israel was a major component as a militarily competent, technologically advanced, and very dependable state. Why was it dependable? Well, because it was utterly dependent on the United States for survival. In the conditions of military confrontation, as long as a military conflict continues there, Israel is, in fact, very dependent entirely on the United States for its survival. The level of armaments in the region is fantastic. Anything gets out of control, they could be wiped out. To keep their military edge, they require massive support from the United States, and being dependent, they're therefore assumed to be dependable, and therefore they perform these services. Well, all of that is what's called the strategic asset theory. There are more connections than that. There are intelligence connections which are considered valuable to American intelligence. They cooperate in weapons development. They are able to try out weapons in the field, which is very valuable, particularly against defenseless targets, which is the best way to do it. There's no way directly for the Pentagon to try it out, but Israel can try out the new fancy weapon systems, which is considered, again, a big gift and so on. And they sometimes capture, advanced Russian armaments, and intelligence likes that, and so on. So lots of services and connections, and all of that put together is the strategic asset theory. Now, one could argue that this is a crazy policy. Okay, that's another question. But it's not one that lacks logic. That's what's important. And it has been the one that's dominated. As to why it's dominated, you probably have to look at the domestic American political scene and all sorts of other things. But the fact that it's dominated is a fact, and that's for our purposes here. It's enough to point that out. And for this reason, the United States has been blocking any political settlement, because a political settlement would terminate these arrangements. In a political settlement, Israel would simply be absorbed into the region as its technologically and industrially most advanced component, but instead of being a kind of a Prussia or a Sparta on call for services, it would be a kind of a Switzerland or a Luxembourg, and that's essentially no use for the purposes of serving as a regional gendarme or a global mercenary. In 1979, the Shah of Iran was overthrown in a popular revolution, and that meant that one of the two components of this tripartite alliance was gone. The United States at once began to move with Saudi Arabian and Israeli support to try to overthrow the new regime. That was the point, there's no doubt in my mind that that was the point of the arms flow to Iran beginning right away in 1979 and 1980 through Israel with Saudi Arabian support. Again, this was quite well known in the early 80s, mostly, in fact, entirely suppressed in the Iran-Contra hearings, but that began right away. And the Israelis who were involved, the top-level Israelis, including the Israeli ambassador, the current Israeli foreign minister, Moshe Aarons, pointed out way back in 1982 that the purpose of the arms flow to Iran was to overthrow the civilian regime. Remember, it's a very typical technique. When you're trying to overthrow some civilian government, it's natural and almost a reflex to send them arms. That's what you do all the time. I mean, and it makes perfect sense. How do you overthrow a civilian regime? Well, you make contacts with the domestic military, and they'll overthrow the regime for you. But to make contacts with the military, you have to have contacts, training, arms sales, that sort of thing. So it's typical, over and over again, to overthrow, if you want to overthrow a civilian regime, you arm them. The United States, as everybody knows, was trying to overthrow the Allende regime in Chile, and throughout that whole period it was sending Chile arms, and it worked. And we were rewarded by the Pinochet coup. Same thing was done in Indonesia and Brazil. I mean, it's standard. And it's pretty clear that immediately after the overthrow of the Shah, this operation began again in Iran. And, the end pieces of it were misleadingly described in the Iran-Contra hearings. But it began really in the early 80s. It was quite obvious already by then. There was plenty of evidence for it. The fact that Israel and Iran and Saudi Arabia were involved in all of this, as was exposed in the Iran-Contra hearings, is not in the least surprising. In fact, that should have been precisely anticipated, because it's simply an attempt to reconstruct the tripartite alliance that was the basis for U.S. power in the region. Well, that Iranian part didn't succeed, but although the whole thing is still going on, incidentally, that's part of the maneuverings today. As the Shah, after the Shah fell, Israel's role as a strategic asset became more important, because it was the last gendarme. And in fact, U.S. aid to Israel shot up at that time, 79, 1980, around then, from 79 to 1982, U.S. aid to Israel, even official aid, you look at the whole story, it's more, but the official aid reached about 50% of total U.S. aid in the world. That's a lot for a small country. And it reflects the significance of maintaining U.S. dominance over that strategically critical region. Well, that's the logic of the U.S. opposition to a political settlement over many years. I think it's the logic of the current rejection of a political settlement, which the U.S. is still engaged in. After the Shah fell, Israel's role as a strategic asset became more important, because it was the last gendarme. And in fact, U.S. aid to Israel shot up at that time, 79, 1980, around then, from 79 to 1982, U.S. aid to Israel, even official aid, you look at the whole story, it's more, but the official aid reached about 50% of total U.S. aid in the world. That's a lot for a small country. And it reflects the significance of maintaining U.S. dominance over that strategically critical region. Well, that's the logic of the U.S. opposition to a political settlement over many years. I think it's the logic of the current rejection of a political settlement, which the U.S. is still engaged in. Now, why has the last comment, why has the U.S. modified its position with regard to dealing with the Palestinians, even though the Palestinians haven't changed their position at all? Well, that's an interesting question, and we can get some insight into it by looking at earlier events. So let's go back to the relations with Sadat of Egypt. Everyone who reads the American press or journals or books and so on knows that Sadat is the one good Arab. All Arabs are bad, but Sadat is the one good one, which is why he was killed, because the Arabs always kill the good guy. Now, why was Sadat the good Arab? Well, the official story is that although Sadat was originally a bad Arab, like all the rest, that is, all he wanted to do was kill Jews, and like all Arabs do, in 1973, he tried, in the October War, tried to kill all the Jews, and it didn't work. And then, after that, under the kindly tutelage of Henry Kissinger and Jimmy Carter, he became a man of peace, and he flew to Jerusalem in 1977, and he offered peace. And then, of course, in our magnanimity, we accepted peace, and then came the Camp David agreements, and Sadat was a man of peace. That's the official story. The actual truth is a little bit different. The actual truth is that Sadat made a peace offer in February 1971, which was more favorable to Israel than the one that he made in Jerusalem in 1977. Rather interesting point. In his February 1971 proposal, which Israel and the United States rejected, he offered nothing to the Palestinians, zero. That's supposed to be what Israel wants. In 1977, when he came to Jerusalem, he insisted on a Palestinian state. Now, the reason for that is that the international consensus had changed. From about 67 up till mid-1970s, this general international consensus was rejectionist. It offered nothing to the Palestinians. It called for a settlement on the internationally recognized borders along the lines of UN 242 as understood throughout the world and along the lines of the Rogers Plan and Sadat's proposal. Nothing for the Palestinians, right? Just a return to the status quo. Jordan takes the West Bank, Egypt takes the Gaza Strip, that's it. It's supposed to be what Israel and the United States want. Well, Israel and the United States rejected it. By the mid-70s, the terms of that consensus had shifted for all sorts of reasons indigenous to the area. It had shifted to include a Palestinian state, that is, a right of Palestinian self-determination. At that point, the Palestinians joined the consensus. Obviously, they didn't before, transparently. They had never agreed to their own lack of a right of self-determination. But when that became part of this broad international consensus, they joined as well, as did the major Arab states, and then you get things like the proposal of 1976 and Sadat's proposal in Jerusalem in 1977, which reflected the current international consensus. The United States still opposed, of course, namely a Palestinian state and recognition of the right of all states to live in peace and security and so on. Now, why did the now notice that Sadat's 77 proposal is allowed to enter history, makes him a man of peace, in fact. But his more forthcoming 1971 proposal is not allowed to enter history. Why is that? Well, the reason is quite intelligible when you go back to the meaning of the word peace process. Recall that the peace process is whatever the United States is pursuing. Now, in 1971, the United States was opposed to Sadat's offer. Therefore, it's not part of the peace process. But in 1977, the United States was willing to adapt in its own terms to Sadat's offer. Therefore, it's part of the peace process. The United States didn't pursue the actual offer, but it was willing to deal with it. What happened in between? Well, what happened in between is the following. After the rejection of Sadat's 1971 offer, Egypt and also Syria made it extremely clear that if the United States and Israel blocked all diplomatic efforts at settlement, Egypt was going to have to go to war. Israel dismissed it. The United States dismissed it. It was assumed at that time that Egypt was a basket case, that the Arabs didn't know which end of the gun to hold. As the chief of Israeli military intelligence put it, now a noted dove, Yehoshaphat Harkabi, war is not the Arabs' game. They just don't know how to play that game. So we don't have to worry about them. So therefore they were dismissed. Again, one of the usual standard intelligence catastrophes. Intelligence catastrophes are standard throughout modern history, and this was one of them. They understand virtually nothing except sort of technical details about, the size of guns and things like that. This was one of them. Both Israeli and U.S. intelligence simply said, war is not the Arab game. We don't have to worry about what they're up to. So therefore we can reject these proposals, and the United States rejected them. Kissinger was getting messages from the oil companies, from U.S. ambassadors in the region, from the Arab states, from every source, saying that if he continued with the policy of stalemate, continued to block Egyptian initiatives, Sadat was going to have to go to war. In 1973, Israel, the labor government, Golda Meir's labor government, announced a plan to settle the northeast Sinai after they had driven out probably 10,000 Arab farmers, driven them into the desert. They were installing Jewish settlements. They were building a city, and the city of Yamit. And Sadat announced straight out, if that goes on, he's going to have to go to war. Well, nobody believed him. Nobody paid any attention. War is not the Arabs' game, and so on. Anyhow, the war came in October 1973, and to the great surprise of Israeli and American intelligence, war was the Arabs' game. In fact, they won a rather stupendous military success in the early stages of the war, still pretty spectacular, and they achieved their main goal. They forced the United States to recognize that they had to deal with them. Now, there is one thing that Kissinger understood, and that's violence. He's capable of understanding that. Other things, not much. But violence obviously wasn't, violence succeeded. I mean, Israel was in great danger, in fact. It was a real serious danger initially. And that made its point. After that, the United States recognized that you can't dismiss Egypt. They're not a basket case. So there has to be a fallback position. Well, the obvious fallback position is, since you can't dismiss them, exclude them from the conflict. Exclude the major Arab state, the major Arab deterrent from the conflict. And that was the position to which the United States moved. Now, and how do you do that? Well, you do it by separating Israel and Egypt in the Sinai. So Kissinger began what's called his shuttle diplomacy, and it all ended up with the Camp David agreements, which essentially excluded Egypt from the conflict, eliminating the major Arab deterrent, which allowed Israel, with, as I mentioned, increasing American support, vastly increasing American support, it allowed Israel to, it made them free to continue to integrate the occupied territories and to attack their northern neighbor, because there was no Arab deterrent anymore, which is exactly what happened beginning in 1978. Perfectly predictable. In retrospect, it's even conceded by strategic analysts, but it's clear that that's what was going to happen. It was clear then. It's exactly what happened. And again, it's a sort of has a logic, has a rational policy. You can't dismiss Egypt as a basket case, so remove them from the conflict. That's Camp David. Now, in that context, you could accept Sadat as a peacemaker, and therefore he was hailed as a man of peace when he offered a proposal to Egypt that was less forthcoming than the one that had been rejected in February '71. That's how policy adjusts. Policymakers, you may not like it, but the fact is that top policymakers typically understand only one thing: the success of violence. If it works, everything's fine. If it doesn't work, you got to adjust. That's the reality you have to adjust to. Well, that was one adjustment. The next major adjustment in U.S. policy came after the Lebanese War in 1982. Israel attacked Lebanon in 1982. The purpose, as was again clear at the time and is now conceded in retrospect, the purpose was to block PLO peaceful initiatives. Israel was deeply concerned over the fact that the PLO was increasingly and openly coming forth with political proposals, and that had to be stopped. And the way to stop them is to destroy the social base of the PLO in Lebanon, to try to turn them back to terror. If they're back doing terrorist operations, that's fine, because that you can take care of. But it's the diplomatic initiatives that are a concern, because that might lead to a political settlement that the United States and Israel are opposed to. In fact, the same Yehoshafat Harkabi, who I quoted before, former head of Israeli military intelligence, points out correctly, of course, that the war in Lebanon should not be called the war for peace for Galilee. It should be called the war to preserve Israel's control over the occupied territories by blocking PLO initiatives. And that, the United States backed that. The United States backed the war against Lebanon all the way through the savage bombing of Beirut. All the way through, it got complete U.S. backing, both from the government and even more backing from the Democratic opposition, who were even more enthusiastic, and even more backing from the left, I should say. Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda were standing on the hills above Beirut, urging the Israeli artillery on to kill more people and so on. So there was a very broad support for it in the United States all the way through. However, it didn't work. Israel failed militarily, and they know it. They were able to, kill a lot of Palestinians and Lebanese, but they did not succeed against Syrian forces, and they know it very well. There are internal reassessments in the Israeli army. They were unable to drive the Syrians out of fixed military positions. They won the technological war, but not the war on the ground. They weren't able to break the Damascus-Beirut highway until the very end of the war, after months, which was a big defeat for them. And there was a reassessment. They did not achieve the goals of establishing what Defense Minister Sharon called a new order in Lebanon, a Christian-run state, a state run by Israeli mercenaries, which would extend Israeli dominance over Lebanon. They couldn't do that. They could not maintain control over the Litani River, the river in the south, which they surely wanted, and they had to withdraw partially. They were then driven out of Lebanon by Shiite resistance, which is a very important fact and very surprising to them. They did not expect that domestic resistance could become so costly to the Israeli occupiers that they'd have to withdraw. But it happened. And in fact, they had to withdraw from all of Lebanon except this southern security zone. Now, that was a big defeat, and it was recognized as such. And in the light of those military realities, the United States and Israel reassessed their position. Now, they still assumed that the Palestinians in the occupied territories could be controlled by force. The Egyptians were out of control, the Lebanese Shiites were out of control, but the Palestinians in the occupied territories, those you can control by force. Israeli intelligence was certain of that. Well, it was working more or less. There was plenty of violence, plenty of repression, collective punishment, all this stuff. It all went by with nobody paying any attention to it because it was controlled. But starting in December 1987, when the Intifada, the uprising, began, and in the 15 months since, it has become clear that the Palestinians in the occupied territories can't be easily controlled either. And again, people in power who understand violence and its success recognize that violence isn't working there either, and they're beginning to reassess their policies. So the proposals of the PLO for years for a political settlement, which have disappeared from history, you can now listen to. Beginning in late 1988, it became possible for the New York Times to admit the fact that the PLO was proposing a political settlement, as they'd been doing for the past 13 years. But then you didn't have to admit it any more than you had to recognize Sadat's offer at the time when you thought that violence was working. In short, when violence is losing its efficacy, planners and the media and ideologues have to reassess their policy. Now, how did they reassess it? Now we come to the current period and the magic words. We're now up to late 1988. In November 1988, the Palestine National Council had a meeting in Algiers in which they declared an independent Palestinian state, which was new. And beyond that, they reiterated the familiar PLO positions. A two-state settlement with recognition of the right of all states in the region to secure and recognize borders to UN 242 and so on. The United States rejected that. The United States government rejected it. Therefore, the media, 100%, and the American intellectual community, 100%, rejected it as inadequate. Arafat then repeated the same statements in Stockholm with a meeting with Jewish leaders. The United States government rejected it, therefore the media rejected it, including the media doves, and the intellectual community rejected it. They're following their marching orders. The government rejects it, we reject it. That's the algorithm. Arafat was then going to come to New York to the UN General Assembly to deliver the same message. Washington blocked it. That was supported in the United States, overwhelmingly. There were a few criticisms, but overwhelmingly supported, including by the doves. Can't allow that. Arafat was excluded on the grounds that he's a terrorist, and we don't admit terrorists. It's too dangerous. The idea apparently was he was going to hijack a taxi cab in New York, or maybe take over the Pentagon or something like that. We allow all sorts of, we allow Yitzhak Shamir, but not Arafat. Well, okay, the United States at this point was the reaction in the world was like your reaction a minute ago. The United States was becoming an object of international ridicule. You didn't know that if you read the American press, but take a look at the European press. It was really becoming an object of international ridicule at that point. The United States was demanding not only that Arafat take the positions that virtually the entire world thought were quite legitimate and adequate and they'd been taken for years, but that he repeat the words written for him by the State Department. And the refusal of the United States to allow him to come to Geneva, which was of course illegal, to New York, which was flat illegal, was denounced over the world, including U.S. NATO allies. Well, they held the UN session in Geneva. Arafat made a statement which repeated the familiar statements. Washington rejected it. The media rejected it. The New York Times on December 14th, referring to the December 13th statement, had a big editorial saying, no, the old Arafat hedge doesn't mean anything. The United States is right to reject it. At that point, the United States was really becoming diplomatically isolated and an object of ridicule, as I stated. Arafat then had a press conference in which he repeated exactly the same positions, and then George Shultz came out on television and said, okay, he's accepted our terms. We can now have negotiations with him, at which point the whole press immediately switched, because they're following their marching orders, and we now talk about this tremendous diplomatic victory. We forced Arafat to capitulate. In fact, his positions were exactly as different from the U.S. positions as before, and now let's take a look at that, the last point, because it's critical. The U.S. positions were quite explicit. There were three conditions. Condition one is that Arafat must accept UN 242 without qualifications. Now, what were the qualifications? The qualifications were that he had always coupled his acceptance of UN 242 with the insistence that these terms be extended to Palestinian rights. 242 talks about the rights of states. It says nothing about the Palestinians. And the PLO position had been, yes, UN 242 is fine, but we have to add to it the right of Palestinian self-determination. Then we accept it. That was the qualification that the United States doesn't accept. Why? Because the United States does not accept the right of Palestinian self-determination. We do not regard Palestinians as human beings. They do not have the rights that we accord to Jews. Jews have a right of self-determination in the former Palestine, but the indigenous population doesn't. That's the U.S. position, and therefore he's not allowed. I hope that clapping means what I hope it does, but it's rather ambiguous, you'll notice. In any event, the position of the United States has been strictly racist. Palestinians do not have rights that we grant to Jews. Okay, and the Palestinians had always added that natural qualification that they should have the same rights. Well, in his press conference, Arafat repeated the same qualification. He did not abandon the right of national self-determination. You take a look at his statement. He said, "We accept the right of all states to exist in peace and security, including a new Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip." Exactly the position he'd always taken, exactly as different from the American position as it had ever been. The United States claimed that he had capitulated. That means we have now imposed upon him our interpretation. According to the U.S. interpretation, which the media 100%, to my knowledge, accept, Arafat has accepted our terms. He has abandoned the right of self-determination. And now we can demand that he keep to that because we've imposed that illusion as reality. And since we make up the world, because we're powerful, that's the reality, whatever the facts may be. And if he simply lives up to the actual reality, he can be punished. Okay? That's the technique, standard diplomatic technique that you can carry out if you're a superpower. That's point one. The second point, which the United States insisted on as the basic one, is that Arafat accept Israel's right to exist without qualification. That was point two. Now, the Palestinians have always refused to do that, and they still refuse to do it. And there's something at stake here. The concept right to exist does not exist in international affairs. No state is accorded a right to exist, an abstract right to exist. The legitimacy of any particular state is not accepted in international law. We do not accept the right of the Soviet Union to exist in its actual boundaries. We celebrate Captive Nations Week every year to express that fact. Mexico probably doesn't accept the right to exist of the United States sitting on half of Mexico. At least they shouldn't. The states accept one another. They accept the fact of the existence, but not the right of existence. Now, the right of existence was introduced by Henry Kissinger in 1975 as a technique for barring the threat of diplomacy. The thought was that the Palestinians will never accept Israel's abstract right to exist. That is, they may recognize Israel, but they're not going to accept the legitimacy of everything that happened to them. They're not going to say everything that ever happened to us was fine because Israel had a right to do it. They won't accept the legitimacy of their dispossession. They'll only accept the fact of it. And for that reason, the right to exist story was invented. Well, it is now claimed that Arafat accepted Israel's right to exist. He didn't. He accepted Israel's right to exist in peace and security, UN 242, and that's a totally different thing. We do not accept Soviet Union's right to exist. We do accept their right to exist in peace and security. That is not to be subject to terrorism and aggression, at least in theory we do. Now that's a critical difference, and that difference remained as it had always been. Now what's point three? That's in many ways the most interesting of all. Point three was, the State Department condition was that Arafat reject terrorism without qualification. Okay? Now in all the statements, PNC, the Palestinian National Council, meeting in November, Arafat's subsequent statements, Geneva, he had always added a qualification. And therefore, the American media described it as the old Arafat hedge. He's ambiguous. The doves, like Anthony Lewis, said, well, he's making progress, but he still has more to go because he's always adding that qualification and so on. What was the qualification? Well, that's interesting. Here you see the utility of suppressing unwelcome facts. The qualification is this. There are the Palestinians, including the PLO and the Palestinian National Council, had always, for years, had accepted UN declarations on terrorism. And they did so again in Algiers. They endorsed the UN resolutions on terrorism, and in fact, they essentially repeated their wording. Now, the UN resolutions on terrorism are supported by an overwhelming majority of the world. In fact, the last vote, which was December 1987, was 153 to 2, with Honduras alone abstaining. So, and that means all the NATO powers voting for it. In fact, everybody voting for it except two, the United States and Israel. What is the reason for the United States and Israel opposing the UN resolutions on terrorism? Well, you read the resolution, you quickly understand it. The resolution condemns terrorism in all its forms and says all states have to work to eradicate this plague and so on and so forth. But then it adds a critical paragraph. The paragraph says, nothing in this resolution shall prejudice the rights of peoples to struggle for self-determination against racist and colonialist regimes and foreign occupation. Now, there's 3 countries in the world that are opposed to that: the United States, Israel, and South Africa, which doesn't vote. And that's the qualification. The qualification that we demand, including the American doves, is that Arafat join us off the spectrum of world opinion. Join us in South Africa off the spectrum of world opinion by renouncing the right of people to struggle for self-determination against racist and colonialist regimes and foreign occupation. Nobody in the world agrees with this, except South Africa. But that's our position, and therefore that's the right position, because whatever the United States does is by definition right. You don't have to argue it. In fact, you don't even have to report it. If the rest of the world doesn't agree with us, the rest of the world doesn't exist. These facts have never even been reported. It's like a kind of a stubborn 3-year-old. You know, I don't like it, so it doesn't exist. The difference is that in this case, the 3-year-old happens to be the world's leading superpower and its media and intellectual community. And if they say the world doesn't exist, it doesn't, because they run the show. So that's the qualification. And in the press conference, the same qualification was added. The PLO made it clear in accompanying statements that they were not abandoning the right to struggle for self-determination against military occupation. Okay? So everything was as before, except that we now claim that the PLO had accepted our terms. And that's crucial, because we have imposed that illusion as the reality, as the operative reality, even though it's not the actual reality. And therefore, if the PLO denies the legitimacy of any of the past dispossession of the Palestinians, or if it claims the right of self-determination, or if it claims the right to resist Israeli soldiers when they break into a liberated village, they're backing off on their solemn promises in the world of illusion, of operative illusion that we've created, and therefore we're legitimate to punish them. Well, why did the United States make that move? Because it was becoming impossible not to. It was impossible to overlook the fact that the uprising was not being suppressed by force, that the world was pressing for a diplomatic settlement. It was necessary to introduce a delaying action. This is the way it was done. Standard great power politics. And you can get away with it if you're a superpower with an extremely servile intellectual community. That's critical. They have to repeat all of this and not expose it. And if you I've said what I think. Now what I urge you to do is go back and look at the documentary record. It won't take very long. It's all quite transparent. Things like this have happened many times in the past. If you want to look at the actual documentation, it's given in this current article of mine in Z Magazine, which I mentioned, but it's pretty transparent. All you have to do is look back at the statements and you'll see that that's the way it works, I think. And I really urge you to do it. It's important. All right, where do we stand now? Well, where we stand now is that I think there's good reason to suppose that the defense minister of Israel is giving the right interpretation, the one that I started with, that there is a delaying action. The United States tried to keep its diplomatic options open. Israel will now do exactly what the defense minister says. They will try to crush the uprising by force. They figure they got another year to do it. And if they don't, if they can't crush it by force, then the United States will reassess, exactly as it did in the case of Egypt and exactly as it did in the case of Lebanon. If violence doesn't work, you got to reassess. You got to adapt somehow. If they do crush it by force, we go back to the status quo. And that's what's going to happen if there's no domestic reaction within the United States. If the American population lets this happen, that's exactly what's going to happen. But whether it happens or not is very much in our hands. We're not. The media may be slaves of the state, but there's no reason for everybody else to be.
You've been watching The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, a PDX Justice from the Archives lecture, delivered March 15, 1989. In a moment, we will turn to the beginning of the question and answer session from this presentation. Our speaker has been Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics and philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Among his many publications, he is author of Middle East Illusions, which includes his early work, Peace in the Middle East, Reflections on Justice and Nationhood, The Fateful Triangle, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, and 9/11, a collection of interviews published in the aftermath of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And now we return to the question and answer session from Professor Noam Chomsky's presentation, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians.
It seems to me that you have presented a rather facile proposition that a political solution would be easily arrived at, and you mentioned what that solution was, except for bad fascist people in Washington. And I would like to see you discuss the proposition that even with benign people in Washington, there is neither a military nor a political solution to the Israeli-PLO conflict. And the reason is demographic. And my particular angle is global bioethics. And that is that Israel is a secular government that permits controlled fertility, and the Islamic world, including PLO, does not.
That's a very familiar argument for those of you who study Southern Africa, but I won't go into the analogies. I didn't say anything about bad fascist people in Washington. I talked about two positions in Washington, which existed in 1969 and still exist today. You take a look at, you go to the State Department, you talk to the ambassadors, the Foreign Service, you go to the oil companies, which are very influential in U.S. Middle Eastern policy. They have basically been pressing for a political settlement all along, and they've lost out in the internal conflict. There are all kinds of reasons for that they're worth going into, but that's the way it still is today. Now, as to the question of fertility, I don't see what that has to do with a political settlement, to tell you the truth. In fact, there are two major groups in that. If you're interested in the facts, though I don't, let me state in advance that this has nothing to do with the issue. You don't make political settlements unless you're a racist on the basis of checking birth rates. But there are two major groups in the former Palestine that have that area, you know, that have very high birth rates. One is the Palestinians, and the other is the religious Jews. The religious Jews have a very high birth rate, in fact, higher than the Palestinians. And they're becoming, for demographic reasons, a major element. This means the fundamentalists, you know, extreme fundamentalists, are a major element. Their power was shown in the last elections, and it will increase for demographic reasons. So if one were to accept your arguments, we should oppose the State of Israel. But I don't accept the arguments on, at least those who do not want an extremist fundamentalist regime, which is a kind of Jewish version of Khomeini, should oppose the State of Israel on your grounds, and I don't accept those grounds. I mean, the relative birth rates and so on are problems for peoples to work out, not for us to work out as a political settlement. On the other hand, your first statement I agree with. You said it was facile to say that you could just have a two-state political settlement. That's true, and it's worth discussing. I mean, I didn't go into that. I just said that there is an international consensus, and the United States and Israel have blocked it. But bear in mind that there's a question as to whether that consensus is feasible. That's another topic, and I'll be glad to talk about it, but let me wait until it comes up in a question. Anyhow, that point, I think, is a plausible point. It's not easy. There are lots of problems that come up, and they're not the ones that are usually discussed, and they're not the problem of birth rate. Okay, now we'll go there, there, and there.
Yeah. How do you assess the relative importance of the opposition to current policies in the United States and in Israel? And what are some examples of organizations in Israel and organizations in the United States that are starting to question the current and past policies of Israel and the U.S.?
Mm-hmm. Well, part of the problem, I mean, that's an interesting question. Let me define a word first, and so we'll have a way of talking. The word rejectionist. Okay? There's two national groups that claim the right of national self-determination in the former Palestine. That's just a fact, however you assess these claims. It's a fact that there are two national groups. One is the indigenous population, Palestinians. The other is the Jewish immigrants who established the State of Israel. They both claim the right of national self-determination. That's a fact. Let's now define the term rejectionist to mean somebody who rejects one or the other of those claims. Okay, that's what I'm going to mean by a rejectionist. Now, let me stress that that's different than the usage. That's the usage in the world, but it's not the usage in the United States. Remember, in the United States, there's a convention. What the U.S. government does is right. That's the convention. Now, the United States government rejects one of those national claims, but the United States government can't be rejectionist. The reason is rejectionist has a bad connotation to it. It makes you think of like a stubborn 3-year-old or something. So therefore, the good guys can't be rejectionists. So you got to reinterpret the word rejectionism so it refers only to those who deny the rights of Jews. Those are the rejectionists. So Khomeini's a rejectionist and Gaddafi's a rejectionist, but Washington is not rejectionist. Now, note that the conventional usage is, again, strictly racist. It says that there's a fundamental difference. The Palestinians don't have the rights that Jews have. Okay? Maybe somebody can give an argument for that. But anyway, as it's used, it's racist. I want to use the term in a non-racist sense. There are two rights. A person who rejects one or the other is a rejectionist. Maybe they have arguments for it. I'm not going into the assessment of the claims, but that's what I'm going to mean by rejectionist. Now, coming back to your question, I'm going to interpret it, I hope this is right, as meaning what non-rejectionist groups are there in Israel and the United States?
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, in the United States, basically none. No, I mean, let me put it this way. Among U.S. elites, there is a non-rejectionist group. For example, the oil companies have been non-rejectionist. They've been calling for a political settlement. They've been doing it since the early 70s. Very conservative elements in the United States. It has nothing to do with left or right or anything like that. Very conservative elements have been non-rejectionist. So if you read a journal like, say, American Arab Affairs, it's non-rejectionist and it's printed on very glossy paper and looks very fancy, so I suppose it has plenty of business money behind it. And judging by the people who write for it, that's what it looks like. But it's non-rejectionist. It happens to take a position of a substantial part of the American business community which believes that the best way for the United States to maintain control of the oil and everything else in the Middle East is to dampen this conflict and eliminate it. It's an irritant, get rid of it, and then we take over. That's tactical judgment. On the other hand, the dominant position has been rejectionist. Now, what about the general population? Well, part of the problem in the United States, I think, has been that since the 1967 war, the articulate part of the population, the educated, articulate part of the population, has not only been rejectionist, but has been fanatically rejectionist. In fact, anybody who publicly came out with a support for a political settlement or with talk about the rights of the Palestinians or with criticism of the occupation was denounced as a Nazi or a monster or a gangster and a left fascist or a whole bunch of things. I mean, it became literally impossible to discuss the issue. Just out of straight intimidation. Politicians were afraid to open their mouths. People in the media were unable to talk about it. Individuals who did it were subjected to the kind of venom that only the educated classes know how to produce. That's part of their occupation. And it became very ugly. As a result, there's been virtually no debate. And I think that's one of the reasons, that's one of the things that swung policy towards the rejectionist position. It's been basically non-debated. Try to find somebody in the media who is, or in the general spectrum, who's come out for a non-rejectionist position. It's extremely difficult. There are few. You find one or a few scattered around, but very few. And the reason has been primarily intimidation. And again, I stress it's not a left-right issue by any means. As far as the general population is concerned, according to polls, about 2/3 of the population has been non-rejectionist. That is, if people are asked in a poll what's the right answer, by about 2 to 1, they've generally tended to say, yeah, there should be a Palestinian state. But the general population is irrelevant. They don't participate in the political system. They just push buttons every once in a while. And the politically active part of the population, basically the educated, articulate part, they have been extremely rejectionist. It's true of many segments: the Jewish community, the labor bureaucracy, the so-called neoconservatives. I mean, the active, organized liberals, the Christian fundamentalists, many of them are very anti-Semitic, but they're also very pro-Israel. Those two things go along quite easily. Eichmann was a Zionist, for example. And it's been a very broad spectrum. So in the United States, unfortunately, it's been very little public, organized, articulate support for a political settlement, which is one reason why these things have happened. Now, what about in Israel? Well, there it's a complicated story, and we have many illusions about it. According to the standard version, which you read in the New York Times and so on, there's peace forces in Israel, but unfortunately there are no counterparts among the Arabs. Unfortunately, it's the opposite that's the case. The PLO has been non-rejectionist since the mid-70s, sometimes ambiguously, sometimes quite clearly. Now, that's not to say the PLO is a great organization. I don't think it is. I think you can accuse them of all sorts of things. You can accuse them of corruption, incompetence, terror, It's all legitimate, in fact. But that doesn't change the fact that their position has been basically non-rejectionist since their endorsement and maybe preparation of the January 76 proposal. There has been no articulate group in Israel, except for the way out at the margins, that has taken the same position. Now, people refer to Peace Now, but the point is that Peace Now, though it's a pretty big movement, is rejectionist. Peace Now has yet to come out with a proposal in favor of a two-state political settlement. As late as the U.S.-Israeli rejectionism is so extreme that it refuses to allow the Palestinians even to accept to select their own representatives for eventual negotiations. That's really an extreme form of rejectionism. That's what it means to say that the PLO can't participate in negotiations. Just to think how extreme this is, make up an analogy for yourselves, a valid analogy. Let's go back to 1947. And suppose that somebody had said that the Zionist organization can't participate in negotiations. Maybe some Jews can, but not the Zionist organization in negotiations, the kind that led ultimately to the establishment of the State of Israel. If somebody had said that, we would have denounced them as Nazis. And the principle is valid, and the same principle holds today. Same principle holds, at least if you're not a racist. To refuse to allow the Palestinians even to select their own representatives, that's really extreme rejectionism. Now, that analogy isn't perfect, like no historical analogy is perfect, but the differences, there are differences. The most striking difference is that support for the PLO among the Palestinians is considerably higher than support for the Zionist organizations among the Jews in 1947. That's the most striking difference. Other differences that are claimed are mostly not real. Now, until last November, Peace Now was an extreme rejectionist organization. Not only did it refuse to articulate a political settlement, it refused even to agree that the PLO could participate in negotiations. In late November, Peace Now, for the first time, said that Israel should negotiate with the PLO. That means the Palestinians can pick their own representatives. Now, that means they sort of, they abandoned the most extreme rejectionism. As of today, they don't go any further than that. Now, within the Israeli mainstream, as the Intifada has increased and as Israel's been unable to repress it, segments have moved and have recognized that this isn't going to work and that you've got to have a political settlement. So, for example, the same person I mentioned before, Yehoshaphat Harkabi, the former chief of military intelligence, who was a super hawk, has shifted positions on tactical grounds. He now says it's crazy. We've got to grant self-determination and independence in a separate state. And there's other shifts. A good deal of the military command apparently is in favor of this. And the reason is that they can see what's happening. When you train your army to break the bones of children, they're not going to be able to fight a war. In fact, there's, in the Jerusalem Post a couple of weeks ago, there's an article by one of the leading, it's in English so you can read it, by one of the leading Israeli military historians, a man named Martin von Crefeld, that teaches at the Hebrew University. And he says exactly that. He says, look, the Israeli military is going to collapse if it continues to be devoted to repressing the Palestinians. He said, if you want an analogy, you want to know what's going to happen, take a look at Argentina during the Falklands War. The Argentine army had been trained and directed to be a terrorist force to terrorize and murder its own population. When you're trained for that and you face a real army, you can't do it. And he said that's going to happen to Israel too, and Israel can't afford to lose its military edge, because if it does, it's going to be wiped out. Now, that kind of thinking also has led to a willingness to accept a political settlement, and there are other things. But it's pretty hard to find a group in Israel, an identifiable group that has as yet been willing to accept a political settlement. There are undoubtedly individuals by now, and you can begin to find groups, but they have not done it. I mean, there are some, like the Progressive List for Peace and the Communist Party. Those are two who have always accepted a political settlement, but they're pretty marginal. You know, like there are few members in the Knesset. So basically not much. And, you know, I think they could develop. I think they could become significant, in fact, if the United States supported them. Remember, Israel is so dependent on the United States that it's just an incredible level of dependence. There's nothing else like it in the modern world. That unless some group in Israel gets political support here, it's not going to be credible in Israel. That means as long as the United States doesn't have an articulate, significant group pressing for a non-rejectionist political settlement, as long as that doesn't happen, it's very unlikely that such a group can develop with any credibility within Israel, simply because of the relations of dependencies. The real doves will tell you that, and I think they're right. But at the moment, not much.
Could you connect up
Where
the United Nations? What? Could you connect up to the United Nations other resolution which condemned Zionism as racism with a little bit of the history about what you just said about Eichmann being a Zionist, because Zionism includes within itself a double dose of anti-Semitism. From the beginning, it was both anti-Jewish in some ways and, of course, anti-Arab.
Well, there are two separate questions. First, the UN resolution on racism. I mean, in my view, that first of all, it was a totally cynical and hypocritical resolution. Whatever you think about the accuracy of it, the states that voted for it are, for the most part, much more racist than Israel is. So, to begin with, the thing, whatever you think about the statement of fact, it's just pure hypocrisy, and on those grounds alone should be dismissed as, you know, contemptible. If you put that aside and look at the fact, it's also wrong, I think. Here we get into questions of fact, and on questions of fact, people have disagreements. But in my view, at least, Zionism is not in itself racist. Now, if, on the other, I mean, if you look at the policies of the State of Israel, they are racist. But in fact, so are the policies of most states in the world. So there's a narrow point. The policies of the State of Israel, like most states, are racist. And in fact, they should be concerned about that, and so should we, since we support them. I'll give you examples if you like. But most states in the world are more racist, including the ones that voted for the resolution. And the idea that that's somehow inherent in Zionism, I don't think that's correct. I mean, I could explain why if you like, but I don't think it's correct. As for Eichmann, well, here we have to go back to what was going on in the 1930s. We're now talking about the pre-Holocaust period. Now, there's a lot of debates among historians about exactly when the Germans decided to institute the final solution. But it looks as though it was around 1940 or 41, roughly around then. There's a new book by Arno, a historian at Princeton, who claims that it was actually after the Battle of Stalingrad. Anyhow, it was right around then. There's no doubt that in the 1930s, the Nazis had not yet decided, maybe they were thinking about it, but they had not decided on the final solution. They're not going to wipe them all out. What they wanted to do was just get rid of the Jews. The Jews are a cancer eating at the heart of Germany and, you know, all this business, and you got to get rid of them. But they were perfectly happy to get rid of them in Palestine. In that sense, Eichmann was a Zionist. He just said, yeah, we want to get rid of the Jews. If they can go to Madagascar, that's fine. If they can go to Palestine, that's fine. So we're Zionists. And he studied Hebrew. He even he tried to go to Palestine in 1939. He was invited by I think it was by the Israeli Labor Party or some representatives of it, to visit Palestine to talk about this arrangement. The British wouldn't let him in. I think they finally met in Egypt. Now, what about the Jewish side? Well, you know, on the Zionist side, they kind of agreed with that. Zionist ideology is based on rejection of the Enlightenment. You know, it's based on, it's part of the romantic, if you trace it back, it's part of the romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had this idea that, you know, in what they called in the sexist language of the day, the brotherhood of mankind, okay? That was the idea. And there was a romantic opposition to that. It began in Germany, in fact, in the 18th century. It had all to do with the French Revolution and all sorts of things. And the idea was there's got to be purity of blood and race. And there's an organic connection between people and their land, and none of this business about equality and fraternity and, secularism and all that kind of business. I mean, roughly that was going on. And Zionism grew up in large part out of this romantic opposition to Enlightenment values. Zionism was Zionism, it's a broad movement, but the mainstream of it was based on the conception that the Jews can't have a natural life in the diaspora because they just don't belong there. There's an organic connection between the Jews and their land, even if they don't happen to be there at the moment, and the Jews will be able to be restored to a healthy existence if they're back on their land. Now, if you look back at the Zionist literature, even the humanist Zionist literature, you'll discover that they had ambivalent attitudes towards Nazism. On the one hand, they of course rejected its anti-Semitism. On the other hand, they supported its insistence on purity of race and blood and organic connection between a people and its land and all of this anti-Enlightenment business. That runs right through the 1930s, including, well-known spokesmen of humanist Zionism came to the United States and became, liberal leaders of the American Jewish community. And you can understand it. I mean, there is a kind of, a lot of modern nationalisms are like that. Modern nationalism is a very tricky business. People who think of it as a progressive force are kidding themselves. It's not very often. This is one example. I mean, these are part of the complexities of the world. And in fact, there was a sense in which the Nazis and the Zionists agreed. There was a sense in which they agreed, namely the Jews should go back and be resettled in their natural place. Okay, that by 1940 or 41, it was a different story. Then the Nazi policy was just to wipe them all out. Okay, but there was a transition there. So that's the background is complex, quite complex. Actually, it's even more complex if you look in detail. The current Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, was at that time head of a terrorist group, the Lehi, the so-called Stern Gang, which actually sent a representative to the Nazis, tried to send a representative to the Nazis in 1941, offering to make an alliance with them, in which, if they supported the state, Jewish state in Palestine, they would be the Middle Eastern representatives of them, because they, not just on tactical grounds, but because they supported the totalitarian ideals of the Nazis, and they would represent them in the Middle East. That's been a sort of a dirty little secret that people have known for a long time, but have refused to talk about. Though you can read about it in Hebrew literature and so on, but it actually leaked out into the Jerusalem Post a couple of weeks ago for the first time in English, I think. But that's been known for years. The world is complicated when you look at it in detail. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I would question your thesis that the United States' support for Israel has mainly been due to U.S. interests. And, for instance, Israel really has no oil resources to speak of. And as an example of what I'm talking about, I take the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union in 1948 supported the partition of Israel and Palestine, and then a few years later, they decided that it would be more strategic to be on the side of 19 Arab countries than on, the side of Israel. So they, had more support for the Arab side. And I would pose as an alternative thesis that at least in the United States Congress, the Israeli and the Jewish lobbies have been primarily responsible for the extent of U.S. support of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a factual question there, which is not trivial to answer. As for the Soviet support of Israel, remember that the Soviet Union has always accepted a political settlement. They have always been right at the core of the international consensus. They have always taken the position that there should be a political settlement on the pre-June '67 borders, which recognizes the right of Israel to live in peace and security with secure and recognized boundaries. As far as I'm aware, there's never been any deviation from that in Soviet policy. True, they have supported the Arab states, and they've done it for cynical reasons, and all kind of awful things. But the fact of the matter is they have supported that settlement, and when the international consensus shifted, they shifted along with it. As for Israel having no oil, that's of course correct, but I don't think that's the issue. The issue was, could it serve as a strategic asset, as Henry Kissinger and Henry Jackson and others openly stated, and as U.S. policy developed. Now, you point out that the Jewish lobby had a big influence, and I agree. In fact, I sort of alluded to that, but in another form. I didn't refer to the Jewish lobby, but to the fact that there has been the articulate, educated part of the community has been overwhelmingly rejectionist since 1967. Not before that. Before 1967, most of the community, including even most of the Jewish community, didn't care very much about the issue. There was a big turn in 1967 after the Israeli victory. We can ask why, but there's no doubt that it happened. And since that time, there has been there's been a tremendous domestic lobby pressing for a rejectionist approach, for stalemate. Now, it includes what's called the Jewish lobby, but it is by no means restricted to it. It includes, as I said, Christian fundamentalists, who are a big force in the United States, and many of them are very anti-Semitic. It includes the top labor bureaucracy, which is part of it's Jewish, but not all. And it includes elements of the Pentagon, which are not Jewish at all. They just like the services that Israel performs. It includes lots of so-called neoconservative intellectuals who are not Jewish. They just happen to believe in, the utility of violence and controlling the world. And this is a violent element, so it can do it for us. There's all kinds of elements that enter. And I agree that they have. My own feeling is they've had a swing effect. That there was a conflict between elites. And maybe, I don't know how much we disagree, but my view at least is that that conflict could have gone either way. And it went the way it did because of the strong, very articulate and organized domestic support, which was also extremely ugly and succeeded literally in intimidating most opposition, so people were afraid to open their mouths. That part I agree with, but I don't really think it was a Jewish lobby, to tell you the truth. Furthermore, I think, you can sort of test this, I think. I think that idea is based on a pluralist conception, which is not accurate. Ethnic lobbies can have effects, but only if they support a position which is supported by real power. And if you look at the history, you can see that. The effectiveness of the Jewish lobby, so-called, has varied depending on what U.S. policy is. So, for example, in 1956, when Israel attacked Egypt and conquered the Sinai, the United States was strongly opposed to that. Not because the United States had any opposition to Israel conquering the Sinai. When they did it in 1967, we supported it. The problem was that in 1956, they did it with the wrong allies. They did it together with our enemies, France and Britain, whom we had just expelled from the Middle East, so we could take over. And then Israel, France, and Britain came back together and invaded Egypt, and we were opposed to that. In fact, there was a point where we came rather close to going to war to stop our so-called allies from continuing with that. We threatened them, forced them to withdraw, and the U.S. government forced Israel to withdraw. All of that was done just prior to an American election, when you're supposed to be super politically sensitive, and nobody cared. It was just too important. And the effect of the Jewish lobby was virtually zero. They were just in conflict with real power, and therefore they disappeared. The same thing just happened in connection with this dialogue with the PLO. Up until December 14th, you look at the Jewish lobby, so-called, the presidents of the Jewish organizations and so on, they were militantly opposed to any dialogue with the PLO. You go to December 16th, they were all mostly in favor of it, saying a very statesmanlike move on the part of our friend George Shultz and so on and so forth. U.S. policy shifted, so did the Jewish lobby. In fact, if you want my prediction, it's this. If U.S. policy actually turns against Israel, as it could, because I think it's, like the policy of any great power, totally cynical, if it does, what you're going to find is the Jewish lobby and the great articulate spokesmen who are sort of screaming about their love for Israel, they'll mostly be either hiding in the woodwork or supporting the new policy. And the people who are defending Israel will be people like me, who are opposed to the policy now and will be opposed to it then. That's what I would predict will happen. I can't see anything, so if somebody wants to talk.
Down here?
Yeah, okay, over there. Where are we? There? There?
Here?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to bring up the viability question. It's part of the idea that it's not so facile to solve the administration. I guess I don't see the U.S.'s role as being quite as economically oriented and cynical in this area. Secretary Schultz pointed out that the proposed Palestinian homeland ideas that have been tossed out aren't economically viable, and it would seem to me that the potential for another Northern Ireland sort of endless conflict still coming on after the establishment of a Palestinian homeland is definitely there. And I just wondered how you'd answer that.
Yeah. Well, George Shultz's statement that it's not economically viable, we can dismiss. He knows nothing about the topic and he has no information about it. In fact, whether the Palestinian state would be viable or not depends on policy decisions. Israel's also not viable. I mean, Israel's total capital investment since 1948 is, I think, the total capital investment, last time I saw the figures, it come from the United States. Okay? So it's not viable, but it exists, you know, it functions because of the way it plays a role in international affairs and kind of support it gets and so on. As for a Palestinian state, in fact, most states are not viable. You know, abstractly, you know, they support if somebody they exist if somebody supports them or if they play a role and so on and so forth. Now, as far as the Palestinian state is concerned, there's close, careful analyses of it that you can look at if you like, and there are ways in which it could be viable, in fact, quite viable. The Palestinian population is very educated, very highly educated. It can become they have supplied much of the managerial and technical personnel for much of the Arab world. In fact, that's where a lot of their income comes from. It's quite possible that the Palestinian state could begin to play the role that Lebanon used to play. That is the opening toward the West, the place where the banks are and where people can do business and so on and so forth. And it's entirely possible. I mean, of course, the Palestinian state could not survive unless it was supported by certainly Saudi Arabia, and the Arab world, but also was accepted, you know, into the system by Israel and the United States. In that case, there's every reason to believe it would be viable. I don't think that that's the problem that makes the solution difficult. The problems lie elsewhere. The problem is that if there is a Palestinian state, Israel's not viable. That's the real problem. And that problem has to do primarily with resources. And it has nothing to do with oil. It has to do with something that's a much more important resource in the arid Middle East, namely water. Much more important resource there. Nobody knows the details because they won't release the figures, but it seems as if approximately a third of Israel's water comes from the West Bank aquifers. You look at the hydrological structure of the place, there's one big sort of underground water supply, and it's large parts of it in the West Bank, and Israel's tapping it. That's one of the reasons they have not permitted the Arabs in the West Bank to dig deep wells. Only Israelis are allowed to dig deep wells. And as far as the Gaza Strip is concerned, it has basically no water resources. Israel has no more internal resources. Their own water is used to something like 100%. They can't get the Litani River, that river in southern Lebanon, which probably was one of the aims of the Lebanon War, because they were just driven out of Lebanon. There are big problems about the headwaters of the Jordan and all that sort of stuff. Unless some big technological discovery comes along, which at the moment nobody can dream of, you know, maybe some fantastic new technique of desalination or something. But as far as current prospects are concerned, there's basically no way for Israel to survive without West Bank water. That's the main thing. Secondary thing is that the West Bank is Israel's second largest market. It's a controlled market. You know, they don't let anything else in, and they don't let it develop, and they can just export to it. And furthermore, that gives them hard currency because in effect it amounts to trade with the Arab world, since hard currency comes in from the Arab states and that's used to purchase Israeli goods and so on. That's a big loss if they lose it. They would also lose a cheap labor force, a very cheap, easily exploitable labor force. Now, maybe those latter two things can be compensated. Not easily, but maybe. It's the first one, it's not clear how it can be compensated for. And that's the real problem, I think. It's always been the problem. In fact, if you look at internal Israeli cabinet records, there's a lot of documentation on this. Unfortunately, it's all in Hebrew. But I have an article, if you're interested, which runs through some of the main stuff. There's a lot of this has been published in Hebrew. We have almost a day-to-day record of Israeli cabinet meetings from '67 through, I forget when it ends, sometime late '70s, roughly that. And they never raise any security problem. They barely talk about security. They don't even think of it as a problem, but they do talk about water. And because they understand that that's a serious problem. The United States understands it too. In fact, one of the constructive things that the United States did was back in the Eisenhower administration when they proposed a regional water system for the whole area. That made a lot of sense. It didn't get anywhere because Israel was opposed to it and it blew things up and so on and so forth. But the idea made sense. It's really an integrated region. And it's very hard to make an artificial division there that makes any sense. I mean, even if you just look at the place, you travel around that area, it simply makes no sense. Putting a border in there is senseless. You see it as soon as you walk there. And if you look at resources and so on, it makes no sense whatsoever. So in my view, a real two-state settlement is not and has never been viable. What is viable is some sort of federal settlement, some kind of federal arrangement which will involve an economic confederation and some abandonment of national sovereignty, as in any federation. I've always thought myself that that's the most viable solution, and I still think so. But look, it's not our business to impose solutions. It's our business to get the United States to stop blocking solutions. After we stop blocking them, they can figure out solutions.
Yeah, I find it hard to make the determination, so I will let you do it. To choose between asking about your comments on the second of the 3 points in terms of Arafat's so-called capitulation.
The right to exist one.
Yeah, you seem to take a long time about it as though you were yourself recognizing the semantic challenge.
I don't understand that. What I said is something pretty simple. No state in the world has a right to exist, or is granted a right to exist. States are granted the right to live in peace and security. That's a very crucial difference.
Yeah, in terms of the so-called capitulation.
If Arafat had accepted Israel's abstract right to exist, what he would have said is that the dispossession of the Palestinians not only took place, and not only that we recognize that it took place and accept it, but that we accept it as having been legitimate. And there's no reason in the world why I should say that. Nobody in the world says things like that, nor should they. I mean, you can say the world is the way it is. There's a state system, the borders are where they are, but anybody who says that those borders are right and just is immoral to the level of Nazism. There's no state border that I know of that's right and just. They just reflect past conquests. That's why Kissinger invented that term, because he was sure it would never be accepted. That was a way of blocking negotiations. It's an innovation in international affairs. There's no such thing. I can't see. I don't know if I understood your point. Maybe I didn't.
Yes, you did. You spoke to it again. I don't know if I should cheat and put in the other question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Your media has represented the Carter administration as a discontinuity with this unethical spreading of international terrorism through through American hiring, through American hiring of client states. But your scenario today represented the Carter administration as perpetrating this. I was wondering to what extent they both are true, or to what extent we should choose one over the other.
Well, if you look at the Carter administration, it's the only post-war administration that didn't use American forces, as far as we know, did not use American forces directly for international terrorism and aggression. So you could argue that if you want to sort of go by the standards of Nuremberg or something, that maybe Carter is the only president who shouldn't have been hanged by the standards of Nuremberg, arguably. On the other hand, the Carter administration did contribute and to support consciously and massively to large-scale violence. In fact, the Carter administration is primarily responsible for Indonesian terror, which is quite comparable to Pol Pot in those years. So maybe he ought to be hanged too. I don't know. It depends on your judgments. That's in the Indonesian invasion of Timor, primarily supported by the Carter administration. Now, it's true that the Carter administration had lots of talk about human rights being the soul of our foreign policy and all that kind of stuff. And that rhetoric was not without, I mean, in my view, that rhetoric was mostly cynical, but it was not without effect. You know, even cynical rhetoric sometimes has an effect. For example, it supported groups and other societies that were saying they have to use human rights considerations and may have saved lives indirectly. On the other hand, the Carter administration had to be dragged kicking and screaming to observe those human rights restrictions, which mostly came out of congressional legislation. And in fact, the reason they were in congressional legislation is because of the effect of the 60s. See, they don't tell you this, but the way it really worked is there was a big change in the United States in the 60s. There was a kind of a cultural revolution. You know, the country just became a lot more civilized. And one of the effects of that was that a lot of young people who came out of that experience, you know, they had those values, and some of them became congressional legislative assistants. Now, in Congress, the people with most of the brains are the legislative assistants. They do the thinking and work out the plans and so on, and then the congressmen read the statements. Congressional legislative assistants began to press for human rights measures, and some congressmen picked it up, maybe because they believed it or they thought it was useful or whatever. And Congress gradually instituted a human rights program, which is falsely called the Carter Human Rights Program. There are a lot of congressional legislation which the administrations, including the Carter administration, have found all sorts of ways of getting around that make it illegitimate to provide aid to to terrorist and murderous regimes and so on. On these grounds, all the aid to Israel is illegal. You know? I mean, you take a look at what Israel's been doing for 20 years, all the aid is illegal, and the same was true of most of the aid to other countries. Nevertheless, the Carter administration was somewhat different. It at least used the rhetoric, and that was not without effect. I mean, as I say, it strengthened just the rhetoric strengthened other groups who were working for human rights. Now, on the Middle East, the Carter administration, there was an interesting change. This has to do with the question about the Jewish lobby that somebody raised. As the Carter administration came into office, they came out, they looked as though they were going to change policy and come out in favor of a political settlement. Now remember, that was 1977, an important time, a year after the United States had vetoed the first UN resolution when other proposals were coming along. In October 1977, there was a joint Soviet-American statement, Carter-Brezhnev statement, which didn't call for a two-state settlement, but it came pretty close. It called for a political settlement which would preserve, you know, people's rights, lower the level of conflict, very positive resolution. Israel was very much opposed to it, bitterly opposed to it. The American lobby, which I don't think is a Jewish lobby, I repeat, but the American lobby was very much opposed to it. Carter was bitterly attacked for having made that statement. The American media were quite interesting. Typically, when the U.S. government is in conflict with some other state, the president is given primary, you know, he gets the first cup, the issue is framed in terms of the U.S. position. So you turn on the tube and there's the president talking, and, you know, then a bunch of people say how right he is and so on. And then in the interest of fairness, you know, after the ads and sports and so on, somebody else, the other side, is allowed a couple of words. In this case, it was reversed. Actually, there's an interesting book about this, if you're interested, by Montague Kearns. I think it's a woman who, it's from the Georgetown Middle East Study Center or something. She just analyzed media coverage in detail, and it's kind of striking. The Israeli political leadership got the front, and Carter was in the background. He had to sort of, you know, apologize and so on. That's kind of intriguing, you know, and I don't think that's the Jewish lobby. I think that's the general educated community, which had already taken a very strongly rejectionist position, and Carter was considered sort of a traitor to that position. In fact, he backed off. The pressure was enough so that Carter backed off from what looked like an initiative. And after that, there was no further deviation that I know of.
I'm going to have to interrupt. This will have to be the last question for this afternoon's lecture program. However, Professor Chomsky is going to be talking this evening at 7 p.m. in the same place on manufacturing consent, political economy of the mass media. So if we could have the last question and try to keep it brief. We have to whisk Professor Chomsky off to another engagement, but he'll be back at 7. Thanks.
One more question somewhere?
I got one here.
Yeah, go ahead.
The uprising, the Intifada, was not started by the PLO, and they were even surprised by it, and they probably cannot even stop it. But what do you think of the PLO's role in sustaining the Intifada?
I think, well, you know, this is a tricky business, but as far as I can make out, in part from the documentation, in part from having been there and traveled around the villages and talking to organizers and so on, my impression is that I think first of all, I think the Intifada is misdescribed. It's not a matter of people throwing stones. There's a major social revolution going on there. I mean, there's a real social revolution taking place in Palestinian society. The remnants of the feudal structures are being overcome. I mean, relations between men and women are changing, you know, between young and old are changing. The whole business is just changing radically. It's a very large-scale popular social revolution of a very interesting type. And the idea that the PLO initiated this is outlandish. In fact, they don't even understand it. What the PLO role is trying to capitalize on it as best they can. In fact, if you travel around the West Bank, as I did, and you talk to local grassroots activists and organizers, they have a lot of contempt for the PLO. They don't like it much, but they are committed to it. They say, that's our political leadership. We may not like it, they may be corrupt, they may be stupid or whatever, but if you want to have a political settlement, you talk to those guys. Meanwhile, we'll carry out our social revolution here. If there ever is a political settlement, my own guess is there's going to be a real conflict between the PLO bureaucracy and the domestic population in the occupied territories. And that's my strong suspicion. But I suspect that the PLO doesn't know very much about what's going on. In fact, to tell you the honest truth, I also had the feeling that the Palestinian intellectuals in the cities in the West Bank didn't have much of an idea what was going on. Now, that's not a deep impression. It's a relatively superficial impression, but it's the one I got from being there. And if it's true, it wouldn't surprise me very much. I don't think the people in Manhattan have very much idea what's going on in Harlem. You know, you don't know what's going on in your own society, typically. You know what's going on in your own social circles. But in any class-ridden, you know, sex-ridden, etc. society, most people don't know what's going on. They have all sorts of misconceptions based on the, you know, power and hierarchy and so on. What's going on in the villages is what it is, and I suspect that the Palestinian intellectuals in the cities, for the most part, don't know what it is. And I don't think the Israeli intelligence has any idea what it is. There are a few Israeli writers. There's one woman named Shulamit Har-Even, a very good novelist, incidentally. Some of her novels are translated in English, but she's been following it closely. She speaks Arabic, she goes to the villages, talks to people. She's written a lot of stuff in the Hebrew press, and in fact, if you want a recent article of hers was just translated into English. It's a good article. It appears in a kind of dovish journal called New Outlook, which I suspect the library probably has. It's in either the latest issue or the next to latest issue. And it's a translation of an article, one of the several articles of hers in which she describes what you see in the villages when you go. And I think her perception is very accurate. It's exactly what I saw at less depth than she does. And I think, you know, like in a lot of social revolutions, I think people don't understand it who look from the outside or who look from the elite point of view and so on. That's been true throughout history, and I think it's true here.